we're finally going to get to the digging part.
Well, basically what I said we talked about earlier, we're going to dig this test pit roughly about 36 to 42 inches deep. We've got to ensure that we don't have any solid bedrock within 36 inches. The state requires there to be 18 inches of separation from the bottom of the lateral line ditch to where there could be potential rock layer. So that's why we'll dig 36 inches deep. Once he gets the pit dug, I'll actually step down in there and look at that side wall, and I'll take a view at the different horizons in the soil to see the color changes. And those color changes again can be indicators of that perched water table. Now there are soils where, you know, within that 36 to 42 inches that we dig, there's no evidence of a perched water table. That's actually really good. That means our loading rate can be based on the minimum, which would be 0.75 square feet per foot.
So Jeff, how deep does this hole need to be again?
We're shooting for a minimum of 36 to 42 inches, and that is to ensure that we don't have solid bedrock within 36 inches. The reason that's important because these lateral line ditches will be installed at 18 inches, and the state requires 18 inches of separation from the bottom of your lateral line ditch to where that potential bedrock layer could be. So that's why we shoot for 36 inches. We're roughly, to the surface, we're about 42 inches on that side, and we're roughly about 42, 43 inches over here. So number one, we already know that we do not have a bed, I'm gonna get that with this shovel, that we do not have a bedrock issue.
Now the bedrock, that just means it's not going to drain in layman's term pretty much, right?
Well, the concern with that bedrock is if we've got solid bedrock at 36 inches, or less than 36, because at 36 we're good. Right. But if that bedrock is at 32 inches, what the problem arises there is when that wastewater starts going down in the soil, then it's going to hit that rock layer, and there's not going to be any soil there to renovate that wastewater. So it's not going to get cleaned up. So when it hits that rock, basically it could just run anywhere. So now you've got wastewater that's not getting properly renovated. That's the whole purpose of utilizing this soil. This soil is going to filter all the bad stuff out of the wastewater.
So it's basically diluting it so it's not coming straight out, if I'm understanding right.
The soil?
Well, the wastewater when you have
Well,
the
it's
soil
not necessarily diluting it, it's just filtering it in essence. The soil is going to act as your filter. Okay. When that wastewater passes through that soil, basically this soil serves as a filter, and that's what cleans up the wastewater. Well, if we just got no soil on top of that rock, again, we just run that wastewater through and it hits that rock, and then it just takes off and it could go anywhere. And the concern would be that it would potentially get to the water aquifer and impact somebody's water well without it being properly renovated. Gotcha. So what I'm going to do is try to determine these different characteristics in the soil. But basically we start off with a brownish loam. This material, again, we talked about the texture. We're going to look at that. This has got a lot of sand in it. It's very, very gritty. We can tell, or I can tell by feeling of it, that it's got a lot of sand. The soil is going to be comprised of three components: sand, silt, and clay. Sand obviously is going to feel gritty. A silty soil feels like flour in your hand. You can run it through your hands and it feels like flour. Typically, whenever we've got a soil with a higher concentration of clay, then it becomes a lot more sticky. And what we normally try to do with that is we get the soil and we try to make it ribbon. And when I say ribbon, we'll ball it up and we'll try to make it ribbon out to usually 1 inch to 2 inches. The more it ribbons out, basically the more clay that's in that soil. This soil is not a heavy clay at all, because even at that depth, it's still pretty gritty. Now, obviously the deeper you go, you're going to pick up a little more clay, but it's not at a point to where it ribbons very much at all. So that
clay bad? If you have a lot of clay, is that bad?
Clay can be a limiting factor, yes. If you've got a shallow clay, then again, I don't want to do as a designer is if I've got a heavy clay at 18 inches, we don't want those lateral line ditches to go into that depth, because wastewater is not going to move through that clay very well. It's just going to, basically it's just not going to permeate and allow any water movement. What could potentially happen in that scenario is once that trench gets completely full, and if it's a heavy clay soil, then it's not having an opportunity to go out in those trenches because it's so tight, then it's going to want to try to come to the surface. And then of course that could constitute a septic system failure or malfunction if you have wastewater that comes to the top of the surface. But I can see myself, we've got about 10 inches of the light brown, and then it's going to be hard to tell with the camera, but there is a color change. It gets a little bit lighter right at that level, and that is what we call a different soil horizon. This is the upper horizon that goes about 0 to 10, and then we're going to have what we call an A horizon, and that's going to go probably, that second horizon goes to about 22 inches.
And that's just different soil types, basically?
Well, the soil textures will change, but basically in the soil terms, they call those different horizons due to the color change. It's just part of the hydraulic conductivity, of rainwater and groundwater. But what I'm going to try to determine, or what I am going to determine, is at what depth do we start picking up some of these lighter grays. Now, when I examine this, it's still basically that lighter brown color. There's not really much gray in that. Okay, we're starting to pick up. They're pretty faint, but they're starting to be just a few little, what we would call some gray mottling. We can kind of see it. Again, it's going to be hard to tell, but when you in between some of these, there's a little bit of gray, and in some of these black, these stains, that's what we just refer to as iron stains, and that can also be based on the fact that the soil has been a little bit saturated. The texture is really good, even down towards the bottom. Okay, this piece is a little bit easier to tell, for me anyway, that there's a little bit of gray in there. That depth, that's going to be 30 inches plus. Based on from what I'm seeing with this pit, I don't see any gray mottling or any evidence of a shallow perched water table. That again, everything is based on the depth of that perched water table. So in this scenario, with it being roughly 28 to 30 inches, it should not cause any extreme issues with the loading rate, because those trenches only go in, again, 18 inches. Now, one thing that would probably be recommended for this site is what we call a curtain drain. It's real similar to a French drain with your landscaping, but the purpose of a curtain drain is to try to intercept subsurface groundwater before it gets to your lateral field. We know we've got a mountain up above us, and obviously during rain events, surface water goes from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. Well, subsurface water does the same thing. It's going to go from a higher elevation to a lower elevation. So what we would do with a curtain drain, if this ditch was being utilized as the #1 lateral line, so going this direction, I would go 10 feet up slope of line #1, and we dig that curtain drain. Basically, it's a ditch about 36 inches deep. We put the 4-inch perforated pipe in the bottom, and then we'll bring gravel in to about 6 inches to the surface. And then in this scenario, let's say this was our curtain drain. This is our downslope side. The reason we call it a curtain drain is because on that downslope side, they would actually put plastic or bisqueen. So when that subsurface water starts coming underneath and it hits that curtain drain, it hits that ditch, it hits that plastic, then it's forced to the bottom of that ditch. Well, now we've intercepted groundwater, so we've made efforts to keep our lateral field area drier. Once we intercept that groundwater, we've got to go daylight it somewhere. On this particular site, the easiest thing to do would be to take it around the ends, one of the ends of the lateral field, and have it drain towards the pond. Now, you're thinking, why are you running that towards the pond? Well, again, it's just groundwater. We're upslope from our leach field, so we're not picking up any black water or any septic water. We're just picking up groundwater. So it's perfectly safe to discharge that and have it feed into the pond. It's obviously just more water that's going to go in the pond.
It's smart too, the way with weather patterns to run it to your pond, to keep your pond full. That's another thought process there. So the bottom line, we're just going to ask Jeff everything you've heard. This looks like it's good soil and ready to go, and no issues.
Based on my soil evaluation, I don't see any restrictions in the soil that would prevent a standard septic system from being installed. Now again, part of the design at one point would be submitting my field notes and my soil information to the state inspector. Once he comes out, he also reviews the soil, and hopefully, he concurs with what I have submitted. We might have a little bit of a discrepancy. An inch or two is not going to be a deal breaker, and typically we're pretty close, on our soil descriptions.
So you just told me something that was really fascinating about post holes and percolation tests and what they used to be and what they are compared to now.
Okay, what we were discussing, everybody says that you got to get a perk test done. Well, technically, we're not doing a perk test. Now, years ago, when the regulations went in effect in 1978 for Arkansas, what they did a true percolation test. A gentleman would go out within the proposed lateral field area with post hole diggers, and they would dig 3 different post holes about 18 inches deep, and then part of the procedure was to keep those post hole or those holes completely saturated, completely full of water for 4 hours. After that 4-hour period, they would come back and measure or time how long it would take to drop 1 inch. And back in the day, if anything, an acceptable perk rate was anything from 15 minutes to 60 minutes. If you turned in a permit and it showed a perk rate between 15 and 60, no questions asked. State approved it and the individual had their permit. Well, back in the late 90s, they got away from doing the perk test because a lot of other states had already gone to this method called soil morphology. So we don't do true perk test anymore. We dig pits and we look at the soil characteristics. I get asked a lot of times whenever I come out to do this, and I've gotten a kick over it at times, especially with some old timers. I'll tell them the procedure, they'll be on site, we'll dig the pit, and the guy will look at me and he'll say, "Sir, can I ask you a question?" And I'm sure, "Go ahead." And he said, "How are you going to get enough water to fill up that big old hole?" And I explained to him, "Sir, we're not going to use water. I'm going to look at the soil characteristics." But I do get that question because that's what people relate a perk test to, is having to put water in the ground to determine a perk rate.
So what you're saying is, as years have gone by, the science has gotten better and we do it in a more sophisticated way that's more accurate.
Yes, a lot of other states, and then Arkansas finally decided to, hey, we can get better systems designed if we know our true soil characteristics. Percolation tests can vary, depending on what time of the year that you do those.
Oh, yeah.
Now, you were, supposed to completely saturate your hole for 4 hours to make it, think that it's been raining for 6 months. But a lot of times the state didn't feel like the procedures was getting followed as they needed to. So that's the thing about the soil, is it tells us what's been going on for years and hundreds of years. And I think we can get better systems based on the soil characteristics.
Man, thank you for that history.
You bet. This soil here, now you can really tell where there's a lot of grays in this pad. This is called a pad for this soil, and you can see all of these grays. This is what we refer to as modeling, gray modeling, or redoxomorphic features, and that is what is used to determine where that perch water table is.
Just a quick recap: both pits were a success and came out with they would be great use for septic systems, and yeah, all things well.
Well, we sure appreciate it. Jeff Tyler, if you're looking around Crawford County, he probably gets out a little bit more than here, I'm sure, depending on your schedule. But feel free to call us if you want to get a hold of Jeff. You can tell he knows what he's doing. Also, Jackie Moore on the other end of this. But we appreciate the time and hope you learned something today. This is Ken Larson and Brent Farmer. Have a great afternoon.